Hello, my name is Benjamin Fang, and today we're going to be talking about the American Pageant Chapter 23, which is really about politics during the Gilded Age. Now, our story begins with the Grant administration. So in 1868, the Republicans, decided to nominate Ulysses S. Grant, this famous Civil War hero. Not a big history in politics, but as a hero from the Civil War, he had lots of popular support. Running against him was Horatio Seymour of the Democrats. Now, the Democrats at this time, they really wanted one thing, and that was an end to military reconstruction. They wanted federal troops out of the South. Unfortunately for them, but fortunately for the Republicans, Ulysses S. Grant ended up winning. So during the Grant administration, what you see is large scale corruption, the likes of which the US had never seen before. On a local level, this takes the form of things like the Tweed Ring, a coalition of political bosses who basically conspired to win political elections and milk New York City out of millions of dollars. On a more national level, you saw things like the Credit Mobilier scandal, which is basically the Union Pacific Railroad hiring themselves under a different name to build the railroad and then overcharging them to make as much money as possible. And to prevent any governmental oversight, they bribed key members of Congress and key members of the Grant administration with Credit Mobilier stock to keep their mouths shut. Now, all this large scale corruption really led to a lot of discontent against the Grant administration. So much discontent that in 1872, a large faction of the Republicans actually completely split and formed their own party, the Liberal Republican Party. And during the election of 1872, what you're seeing is Ulysses S. Grant, who's backed by the Republicans, and Horace Greeley, a newspaper editor who looks kind of like Benjamin Franklin, who was backed by the liberal Republicans, as well as the Democrats who believed that Greeley was their best chance to win an election. Unfortunately for them, but once again, fortunately for the Democrats, Grant won a second term. And as Grant's beginning his second term, because of the over speculation that's going on by the bankers, because of the overbuilding of infrastructure throughout America, what you see is the Panic of 1873. You're seeing thousands of businesses close, you're seeing millions of people being unemployed, and there's really this central tension point, this central conflict between two types of people on how to best deal with the Depression. On one side you have debtors who basically they owe other people money, and what they want is more money in circulation so that the value of the dollar goes down and they can pay off their debts easier. On the other hand, you have the creditors, the ones who are loaning other people money, and what they want is the value of the dollar to go up. So less circulation, less money in circulation, more value in the dollar so that their loans gain more value and they get more money in the long term. At the end of the day, Grant decides to side with the creditors, and not only does he reaffirm the US's gold standard, he also withdraws a lot of greenbacks, the paper money that's causing the inflation, so that he ensures that the value of the dollar keeps on going up, which benefits those who are giving out the loans.
While Democrats and Republicans saw eye to eye on most issues, they were still extremely competitive and were categorized by regional and cultural differences. The Democratic Party consisted of Catholic and Lutheran immigrants, Southerners, and political machines in the North, while the Republican Party consisted of Puritans, African Americans, and those living in the Midwest and rural Northeast. During the election of 1876, Democrat Samuel Tilden versus Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, the results were determined by 4 contested votes in the North, and the Democrats agreed to a Republican win in return for support for a Southern Railroad line, as well as the removal of troops in the South, which ultimately led to the end of Reconstruction. With the end of Reconstruction, Democratic Southerners reemerged and exercised their power on African Americans, creating Jim Crow laws to segregate whites and blacks. They continued to suppress African Americans, forcing them into sharecropping so they'd continue to be in debt to white landowners, and would also use violence to deal with those who disobeyed segregationist laws. A Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson, ruled these separate but equal laws to be constitutional. Additionally, Chinese immigrant railroad workers also faced discrimination, as European immigrants were hostile due to the competition for labor and terrorized them. Adding on to this, railroad workers also faced hardships as their wages were cut by 10% in 1877 and retaliated with strikes. These efforts were met with force from federal troops, and the failure of the strikes exposed the weakness of the labor movement, which was partially caused by the racial differences between Chinese and European immigrants.
James A. Garfield and Chester A. Arthur. The Republican Party settled on a dark horse candidate, James A. Garfield, from the electorally powerful state of Ohio. His vice presidential running mate was stalwart henchman Chester A. Arthur of New York. Garfield won. His electoral votes were 214 to 155. A disappointed and mentally deranged office seeker, Charles J. Guiteau, shot President Garfield in the back in a Washington railroad station. Garfield died on September 19, 1881. Guiteau's attorneys argued that he was not guilty because of his incapacity to distinguish right from wrong. This was an early instance of the insanity defense. Garfield's death shocked politicians into reforming the shameful spoils system. The Pendleton Act of 1883, the so-called Magna Carta of civil service reform. The act partially divorced politics from patronage, but it helped drive politicians into marriages of convenience with big business leaders. The Blaine-Cleveland mudslingers of 1884. Blaine's enemies publicized the fishy-smelling Mulligan letters, which was written by Blaine. One of the damning documents ended with the furtive warning, "Burn this letter." Resolute Republicans unearthed the report that Cleveland had been involved in an affair with a Buffalo widow. She had an illegitimate son for whom Cleveland had made financial provision. Democrats urged him to lie, but he insisted, "Tell the truth." Republicans taunted in return, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" Defiant Democrats shouted back, "Gone, gone to the White House, ha ha ha." RRR stands for Rum Romanism and Rebellion, which insulted New York's numerous Irish American voters. Old Grover takes over. Bull-necked Cleveland in 1885 was the first Democrat to take the oath of presidential office since Buchanan 28 years earlier. In 1887, he vetoed a bill to provide seeds for drought-ravaged Texas farmers. Though the people support the government, he declared, the government should not support the people. Cleveland was whipsawed between the demands of the Democratic faithful for jobs and demands of the mugwumps who had helped elect him for reform. He fired almost two-thirds of the 120,000 federal employees, including 40,000 incumbent postmasters, to make room for deserving Democrats. Cleveland battles for a lower tariff. During the Civil War, tariff schedules had been jacked up to a new, high level to raise revenues for the insatiable military machine. By 1881, the Treasury had an annual surplus of $145 million. In order to reduce the surplus, they squandered it on pensions and pork barrel bills, and they lowered the tariff. Lower barriers equals lower prices for consumers, which equals less protection for monopolies. Blaine gloated, "There's one more president for us in tariff protection," which was Cleveland. Post-Pendleton Act politics of alliances with big businesses raised a war chest of a sum of $3 million. On Election Day, Harrison nosed out Cleveland, 233 to 168 electoral votes. He became the first sitting president to be voted out of his chair since Martin Van Buren in 1840.
Congress was called the $1 billion Congress because they passed the first $1 billion budget in U.S. history. Republicans controlled both houses, and the Speaker of the House was Thomas Reed. The $1 billion Congress increased pensions, passed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and passed the McKinley Tariff Act. The McKinley Tariff caused controversy and caused Republicans to lose their majority in the congressional election of 1890. 9 members of the Farmers Alliance were also elected into Congress. The Farmers Alliance was a movement that sought to improve the conditions of farmers. The Alliance movement set the foundation for the Populist or People's Party to be formed. They sought for citizens to have a greater impact on government, the unlimited coinage of silver, and an 8-hour workday, and a graduated income tax. Their presidential candidate was General James B. Weaver, and although he lost to Cleveland, he won more than 1 million popular votes and 22 electoral votes. The South did not side with the Populist Party because of the Colored Farmers National Alliance. African Americans were overall negatively impacted by the populist movement. White Southerners used literacy tests and poll taxes to deny African Americans the right to vote. The Grandfather Clause stated that these new regulations did not apply to anyone who had voted in 1860, but this is when African Americans could not have voted at all. In addition, Jim Crow laws were put into effect, which enforced racial segregation in public places. Justice Cleveland had been re-elected. America faced the Depression of 1893, which was caused by overspeculation and overbuilding. Businesses collapsed and railroads went bankrupt. The gold reserve also fell to an alarmingly low level of under $100 million. Cleveland repealed the Silver Purchase Act, which caused heated debates in Congress and did not stop the depletion of gold from the Treasury. Cleveland was desperate, so he turned to banker J.P. Morgan, who lended him $65 million in gold. The bond deal was not popular, but the Wilson-Gorman tariff was much more popular among Americans. It lowered tariffs by a small amount and provided a 2% income tax on incomes more than $4,000. Cleveland allowed this bill to become a law without his signature, but the Supreme Court ruled it to be unconstitutional. This allowed for the Republicans to win back their majority in Congress in 1894. Thank you for listening.